They told me I was the sensitive one. My whole life, that's what I was, the sensitive one, the one who cried at commercials, the one who needed help opening jars, the one who sat in the back of family arguments and waited for someone else to be the strong one. I was 71 years old before I found out that every single thing I believed about myself was wrong. And I want to talk to you about that, because I think you might be living inside a lie that someone else handed you a long time ago, and you've been carrying it so carefully for so many years that it doesn't even feel like a lie anymore. It just feels like you. I want to start in a room, a small one, the kind with paper on the examination table that crinkles every time you shift your weight, and a poster on the wall about hand washing that you've read 6 times because you can't look at the doctor. My daughter was sitting in the chair to my left. She had her hands folded in her lap, the way she does when she's trying not to cry. And I remember thinking, she learned that from me. She learned to hold herself together on the outside while everything falls apart on the inside. And I thought, what a terrible thing to teach someone. Stage 3. That's what the doctor said. Stage 3 breast cancer. And here is the thing that still surprises me when I say it out loud. My first emotion was not fear. It was something closer to relief. Because for the first time in 71 years, I had a concrete reason to be exactly as fragile as everyone had always told me I was. Isn't that something? I had permission. But then something else happened, and I'm still not entirely sure how to explain it. My name is Dorothy. I'm 73 now. 2 years past the diagnosis. 14 months past treatment, and I am standing here telling you that stage 3 cancer was not the beginning of my decline. It was, against all logic, the beginning of my strength. And if you're sitting there thinking that doesn't apply to you because you haven't had a diagnosis, stay with me, because your catalyst might be a divorce. It might be retirement and the silence that comes after. It might be an empty house after your last kid moves out. It might just be a Tuesday in January when you look in the mirror and think, who is this person? The container doesn't matter. What I'm going to talk about is what's inside it. Let me tell you about a woman I grew up with. Her name was Frances, and she was my mother's best friend from the time they were both 22 years old. Frances was what we called in those days a capable woman. She could fix a leaky faucet. She could balance a checkbook. She drove herself to the hospital when she went into labor with her 3rd child because her husband was at work and she didn't want to bother anyone. I worshipped her from about the age of 8. She was everything I wasn't. And then Frances turned 64. Her husband died, and she completely fell apart. Not in the dramatic way people talk about, in the quiet way. She stopped driving at night. Then she stopped driving on highways. Then she stopped driving. She let her son take over her finances because, and I remember her saying this, I never really understood it anyway. She moved into a smaller apartment closer to her daughter, and she made herself smaller and smaller until she was about the size of the role her family had always quietly decided she should fill. I visited her when she was 68, 4 years after her husband passed. We had lunch at a diner near her apartment, and I asked her how she was doing, and she said, "Oh, you know me, Dorothy. I was never the strong one." And I sat across from her and I thought, "Frances, you drove yourself to the hospital in labor. What are you talking about?" But I understood it, because I had spent my whole life doing the same thing to myself, just with different evidence. Families have a way of doing that. They assign you a role, the smart one, the funny one, the sensitive one, the difficult one. And everyone performs that role so consistently for so long that you start to mistake the costume for your skin. I was the youngest of 4. My brother Thomas was the strong one. My sister Carol was the capable one. My sister Linda was the funny one. And I was the sensitive one, which in practice meant I was the one who needed looking after. If there was a problem, I wasn't called. If there was a decision, I wasn't consulted. And I didn't argue with this because the truth is, at the time, it felt like love. It felt like them protecting me. It took me decades to understand that it was also, quietly, them limiting me. So I arrived at 71 with a cancer diagnosis and almost no evidence of what I was actually made of. That is a terrifying place to be. And I want to be honest with you. The first 3 weeks after the diagnosis, I leaned into every bit of that fragility. I let Thomas make calls to the insurance company. I let Carol come over and handle my paperwork. I remember sitting at my kitchen table while Carol organized my medical files into color-coded folders, and she was so competent and so in control, and I just watched her and thought, "This is right. This is how it was always supposed to be." And then Carol had to fly home, and Thomas went back to his life, and I was alone at that table with a manila folder and an insurance claim form I didn't know how to fill out, and I had 2 choices. I could call Thomas and ask him to handle it, or I could figure it out myself. I sat with that form for 40 minutes. I'm not going to pretend I wasn't scared of it. It was one of those dense, bureaucratic forms with tiny boxes and confusing language. And every time I read a question, I felt that old familiar voice in my head saying, "You were never good at this, just call someone." But I didn't call someone. I filled out the form. And when I was done, I sat back and felt something I genuinely didn't have a name for at first, because I had never felt it before. I later decided the word for it was competence. Just that, ordinary, quiet competence. I know that sounds small, a form, but you have to understand, I had been performing fragility for so long that I had no idea what I could actually do. It was like I had been walking with a limp for 50 years because someone told me my leg was broken. And then one day I took an X-ray and found out there was never anything wrong with my leg at all. The treatment started in October of 2023. 12 weeks of chemotherapy, then surgery, then 6 weeks of radiation. And during that time, I started noticing something. I was not falling apart. I was functioning. I was not only functioning, there were moments, I am not exaggerating, where I felt more capable than I had ever felt in my adult life. Because all the things I had been afraid of, doctors, forms, difficult conversations, asking questions, advocating for myself, I was doing all of them, not perfectly, with shaking hands and a racing heart sometimes, but I was doing them. There was a moment about 8 weeks into chemo when I had a problem with a contractor who had done some work on my bathroom the previous spring. He owed me a partial refund, and he had been avoiding my calls for 6 months. Before the diagnosis, I would have let it go. The money wasn't enormous, maybe $400. But the old me would have done the math and decided that chasing it would cause more anxiety than it was worth, and I would have quietly absorbed the loss and never mentioned it to anyone because I didn't want to seem like trouble. I called him on a Thursday morning from my oncology waiting room. I was sitting there in a paper gown with a magazine I wasn't reading in my lap, and I thought, I have stage 3 cancer, and I am not afraid of you. I left a voicemail that was calm and clear and specific about what I expected and when. He called back within the hour. I had a check in my mailbox the following week, $400. But that's not really what it was about. Around this time, I met a man named Gerald in the treatment waiting room. He was 67, a retired firefighter from outside Cleveland, and he was there with his wife who was going through her own diagnosis. Gerald and I used to talk while we waited, sometimes for an hour or more. He was one of those people who has clearly been through enough hard things that the performance of toughness has been replaced by something quieter and more real. I asked him once how he had stayed calm for so many years running into burning buildings when the rest of the world was running out. He thought about it for a second, and then he said, Dorothy, courage is not a feeling. It is a direction. I wrote that down on the back of a prescription receipt, and I have kept it in my wallet ever since. Because here's what I know now that I didn't know at 71. I had been waiting my entire life to feel brave before I did brave things. I had the sequence backwards. You don't wait to feel capable before you act. You act, and then you discover that you were capable all along, and the feeling comes after. The feeling is a result, not a prerequisite. There's a study from the American Psychosomatic Society, 2019, that found people who go through major health challenges and come out the other side often describe not just physical recovery, but what the researchers called post-traumatic growth. Measurable increases in psychological strength, clarity about what matters, and confidence in their own ability to handle difficulty. The researchers were surprised by the scale of it. I wasn't, because I had lived it. About 4 months after my surgery, my daughter convinced me to try a self-defense class on Saturday mornings. She had been going for about a year. I was 68. Wait, I was 72 by then. I keep losing track. And I showed up in leggings I had owned since 2015 and absolutely no idea what I was doing. The instructor, a woman named Renata, who was maybe 45 and moved like water, had us start with something called boundary work. Just standing your ground while someone walks toward you and saying clearly, "Stop." That's it. Just stop. I could not do it the first week. I kept softening it. "Stop, please." Or "Stop, sorry." The old habit of managing everyone else's comfort, even in a room full of strangers who had all paid to be there. Renata noticed it, and she came over to me and she said, "Try it again. No please, no sorry, just stop." And I took a breath, and I said it like I meant it, and the word came out of my body differently than any word I had ever spoken in my 72 years of being the sensitive one. It came out from somewhere deeper, and the person walking toward me actually stopped, and Renata smiled at me and said, "There she is." 3 weeks later, I threw my first clean block in a partner drill. My partner's name was Shira. She was 56. She'd left a marriage at 53 after 29 years, and she was there for very similar reasons to mine. When my arm came up and connected with the pad she was holding, there was a sound, this satisfying, solid sound, and Shira looked at me and said, "Dorothy, what was that?" And I said, "I have no idea, but I want to do it again." I want to say something directly to you now, because I think you need to hear it. Whatever role they gave you, the one that said you were too soft, too old, too late, not good at that kind of thing, not built for pressure, that was a story. It was a useful story to the people around you at the time, maybe. It kept the family system running. It filled a slot. But it was not a fact about you. It was an assignment. And the extraordinary thing about assignments is that you can hand them back. I think about Frances sometimes. Frances, who drove herself to the hospital in labor, and then spent the last decade of her life convinced she couldn't manage a highway. She passed 2 years ago. I was at her funeral, and her son gave a beautiful eulogy about how strong she had always been for the family, and how they never saw it until she was gone. And I stood there in that church thinking, she should have been here for this. She needed to know this while she still had time to use it. You still have time to use it. Reinventing yourself at 60, 70, 75, it doesn't look like it does in the movies. It doesn't look like a woman in a convertible with the wind in her hair. It looks like filling out a form alone at a kitchen table. It looks like leaving a firm voicemail. It looks like showing up to a Saturday morning class in old leggings and being willing to be a beginner. It looks quiet from the outside, but from the inside, it is the loudest thing you will ever experience. I am 73 years old. I have stage 3 cancer in my past. I can file my own insurance claims, argue with contractors, and throw a respectable elbow block on a Saturday morning. And I want to tell you that the strength was never something I built. I didn't construct it during chemo. I didn't find it in a waiting room. It was always there. under the role, under the performance, under 50 years of being the sensitive one. They never gave us thin glass. They just told us we were made of it. And some of us believed them for so long that we treated ourselves accordingly, carefully, gingerly, as if we might shatter. But here is what I know now that I wish I had known at 30, at 40, at 50, at 60. You were never made of thin glass. You were tempered steel that nobody ever thought to test. And if the right moment hasn't come for you yet, the diagnosis, the divorce, the empty house, the quiet Tuesday when you look in the mirror, don't wait for it. Don't do what I did. Don't wait until something large enough comes along to force the question. Ask it now. Ask yourself right now what you have been told you can't do, and ask yourself when you last actually tested it. Not assumed, tested, because the answer might surprise you. It might stun you. I promise you, it will not disappoint you. If this landed somewhere it needed to land, tell me in the comments. What role did your family give you? Because I think more of us are carrying borrowed identities than we know. And I'd love to hear that I'm not the only one who spent decades performing fragility they never actually had. And if this is the kind of conversation you want to keep having, subscribe. I'll be here every week, telling the truth.